Okay, so hi everyone. So today's lecture is going to be about God's attributes, more specifically conflicts between God's attributes. So as you know, God's attributes, divine attributes, is part of your year 13 spec. And if you look at the chapter, it focused specifically on those three attributes: omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. As you know, omnipotence is to be all-powerful, omniscience is to be all-knowing, and omnibenevolence is to be all-good. Now, if you look at the chapter, it treats those three attributes separately. But another thing it talks about is the conflicts that can arise between those attributes. So, historically, many philosophers have argued that God, if he exists, cannot have all three of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. And there are various ways in which that might be the case. And we're going to look at those conflicts today. But before we do, notice that this is a very serious challenge. Right? Because for many people, including Anselm, for example, it's part of the definition of God that he is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Remember, Anselm says that God is the greatest conceivable being, and that's the classical definition of God. But of course, if God is the greatest conceivable being, then surely he must have all three of those attributes. He must be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. So, to argue that God can't be all three of those things is effectively to argue that God cannot exist, if you believe that God necessarily must have those three attributes in order to be God. So it's a serious problem, and it's also a problem that comes up quite a bit in the spec. Right? So a typical exam question or essay question is this: the conflicts between God's attributes cannot be resolved. So this question comes up time and time again in the spec. I mean, in different packages, but it's always the same idea. There are conflicts and you can't resolve them. So this essay question, asks you to investigate whether those conflicts can be resolved. We're going to look at 4 conflicts today. Before I address those conflicts specifically, here's some important essay advice. The conflicts are detailed, they're philosophically deep and profound. Therefore, I don't recommend picking more than 3 conflicts. However, I would say pick at least 2. Because remember, the question says conflicts. It's in the plural. So you can't just pick one, right? You can't just pick the one that you like best. You need to address at least 2. And once you've decided those conflicts that you want to address, you need to do, for each of those conflicts, you need to do this. 1, you need to explain the conflict clearly. That's where you get your AO2 from in terms of the mark scheme. Explain why is there a conflict here. Secondly, you need to do your AO2. And in this case, this means arguing whether the conflict can be resolved or not. And that's up to you. It depends on your thesis. Remember, your thesis is what the main argument of your essay. And so depending on what your thesis is, you're going to argue whether or not the conflict in question can be resolved. So let's have a look at our first conflict, and this is something you're all very familiar with. It's the logical problem of evil, so no surprises there. You've all seen Epicurus. J.L. Mackie is another one who famously put forward this problem. And it goes something like this. It's a triad, or a trilemma rather. So, number 1, if God knows that evil exists, wants to prevent it, but is incapable of doing so, he can't do it, then that means he's not omnipotent. If God would want to prevent evil and would be able to do it, but he just doesn't know that it's there, then he's omniscient. Not omniscient, sorry. Lastly, if God knows that evil exists and can prevent it, but just doesn't really want to, can't be asked maybe, then he's not omnibenevolent. That's Epicurus' argument. And notice what he's doing here. He's saying because there's evil, you have to pick 2 of the 3 arguments, the 3 attributes. You can't have all 3 because evil makes it impossible for there to be a being that is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent at the same time. Remember, that's a serious problem because a lot of people think that that's part of the definition of God, that God has to be all 3 of those things. Now, because you've seen this before, and because this is so familiar, you'll also remember how to deal with this sort of problem. You've heard of the theodicies, haven't you? Right, so a theodicy is a solution to the problem of evil. A theodicy is an explanation as to why God prevents or even causes evil. Sorry, doesn't prevent or causes evil. Now, if you look at the trilemma right here, What theodicies are going to do is they're going to pick this one right there. If God knows that evil exists and can prevent it, but doesn't want to. He's not omnibenevolent. So theodicies are going to tackle this part of the problem. And they're going to disagree with Epicurus. They're going to say it's not true that if God knows that evil exists and can prevent it but doesn't want to, then he's not omnibenevolent. So theodicies typically are going to say that God has good reasons for allowing evil. And of course, the ones you're familiar with, the theodicies that you know of from the course, are these ones. So the Augustinian theodicy, so that's the idea that God doesn't actually cause evil. He doesn't cause evil. We cause it through our free will because God gave us the ability to choose right from wrong, and sometimes we choose wrong, and that's why there's evil in the world. Remember the Adam and Eve story. That's where it all started, according to Augustine and according to Christians in general. That's how evil came into the world. It wasn't God, it was human beings who made the wrong decision, turned away from God, separated themselves from God. That's why we have suffering in the world. So that's the first theodicy. And then you have the Irenaean theodicy, which is the soul-making theodicy. So this is the idea that yes, God does cause evil, but he has good reasons to do so. Because evil produces spiritual development. You become better as a result of suffering. For example, as a result of suffering, you will become more compassionate because you understand what it means to suffer. You will become braver, more courageous, because you'll have faced suffering. You'll become more patient. You'll become more sacrificially loving. If there's no evil in the world, then there's no room for sacrificial love. Irenaeus is going to say all of those things. And as you know, John Hick is going to say something very similar. And lastly, the Leibnizian theodicy. Now, that one actually isn't in your textbook, but I've looked into it with some of you, actually, those that I've mentored. And the idea is that God has created the greatest possible world. And we just can't see it because our perspective is so limited. We can only see a part of the world. And so from our perspective, it doesn't look like the world is the greatest conceivable world, right? The best possible world. But if we had the full picture, if we had God's sort of, if we saw it, if we had the full perspective of God, then we would realize that it is the greatest possible world. The only reason why it looks like this is a bad world is because of our limited perspective. That's the Leibnizian theodicy. Again, not in the textbook, but it's pretty straightforward to explain, so it's useful to know it. It's useful to be able to write about it in the exam, especially if you run out of things to say. So those are the theodicies. Now, depending on what your thesis says, right, you're either going to support them and agree with them or disagree with them. So for example, if your thesis says that the attributes of God cannot be reconciled, then you're going to go against the theodicies. You're going to criticize them. And we're not going to go over that because you've gone over it before, and it's all in your textbook and it's all in your notes. So that's the logical problem of evil. It's probably the easiest conflict to talk about because, again, you've looked at it so much, right? But of course, you can't only talk about it if the question is specifically about conflicts in the plural. You need to pick that one and another, perhaps two others. So let's go to the other conflicts. Here's the next one, free will and omniscience. So religious people tend to believe that there's a judgment at the end of time, in the afterlife at least, right? There is a judgment. God decides who gets to go to the good place and who gets to go to the bad place. And he decides on the basis of how good we've been on earth, right? On the basis of righteousness. Now, there's a problem if you think that God knows from eternity past who's going to go to the bad place and who's going to go to the good place. And the reason it's a problem is that if God knows exactly where we're going to end up, right? If he knows exactly what we're going to do in our lives, then it looks like we don't have much of a choice. It looks like we don't have control over our actions, right? But hang on a minute. If we don't have free will, then why does God punish us? Why does God send the wicked to hell, right? Because they didn't choose to be wicked, right? It was God's choice. They were determined to be wicked. So it's unjust for God to send them to hell. And this is why we have a problem, a conflict between omniscience and omnibenevolence. Right? Because if God knows our future attributes, it looks like we don't have free will. But if we don't have free will, then God is unjust for punishing us for actions that are beyond our control. Therefore, you can't have omniscience and omnibenevolence, because omniscience seems to entail that God is not omnibenevolent, that he's unjust because he's punishing us for things over which we have no control. That is the conflict between free will and omniscience, and therefore between omniscience and omnibenevolence. Now, there have been solutions to this problem. We're going to look at two. The first one comes from Boethius and Anselm, two theist philosophers. And Boethius first and then Anselm are going to say that God is outside time. Now that's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to conceive of. God is outside of time. That means that he can see the future in just the same way as he sees the past and the present. Now, it's hard to explain, and again, inconceivable, but one analogy that I like to give is a movie, right? So when you watch a movie, you're outside of the movie. And you can rewind, you can fast forward, you can pause, but if you've seen the movie before, right, you know exactly what's going to happen at the end. You know who's going to die and so forth. You know who's going to betray who and so forth. But that doesn't mean that you're controlling the characters in the movie, does it? Right? It's just that you're outside of the movie. That's why you know exactly what's going to happen. So, Boethius and Anselm conclude that yes, God is omniscient, but he doesn't control our actions. He can just see them. It's not the same. Now, so if you can see the little picture right here, that's just sort of to help you visualize what it means for God to be outside time. Time is an arrow, we're on the arrow, but God is outside of the arrow. And for him, the past, the present, and the future are the same. Now, there are problems, or at least potential problems, you might be able to deal with them, with this view of God, because it entails that God cannot change. If God changes in any way, that means he's in time, because a change is necessarily temporal, right? So it seems to give us the picture of a God who's frozen outside of time. A God who just absolutely does not change. And that's what Aristotle believed, actually. But it doesn't really sit well with the God of monotheism, the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran. Because the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran, especially the God of the Bible, are relational, right? They want to have a relationship with human beings, and certainly in both cases, in both the Bible and the Quran, God interacts, God intervenes in history. And that's hard to reconcile with the idea of a God who never changes at all in any way, right? How do you relate to a God like that? Anyway, I'm not saying that this problem can't be dealt with. In fact, if you check out my Padlet, I provide answers to this problem. But the point is, the problem exists and it needs to be dealt with if you're going to defend Boethius and Anselm. Another proposed solution to the problem of omniscience and free will is Richard Swinburne's solution. So Richard Swinburne is a Christian philosopher, and he says this. He says, God actually doesn't have perfect knowledge of the future. He has very reliable knowledge of what's going to happen in the future, but it's not perfect. He can't be absolutely certain, right? Because the future doesn't exist yet. God is in time, so he doesn't agree with Boethius. God is definitely in time, according to Swinburne. So God can't know for sure what we're going to do in the future. And you might think, well, that's not omniscience, right? Then you've just given up omniscience. But Swinburne would tell you that actually omniscience is to be able to know everything that it is logically possible to know, right? And he's going to say that to know the future perfectly is logically impossible because the future doesn't exist yet, right? And God is in time. So for Swinburne, God can still be omniscient even if he doesn't have infallible, perfect knowledge of the future. That is Richard Swinburne's view. And if you were to answer it and criticize it, you could say this. You could say it's not real omniscience, right? It's watered down omniscience. It's not what we mean when we say that God is all-knowing. It seems to reduce God, make him less grand, less worthy of worship. That would be the main sort of argument against Swinburne. But again, you don't have to agree with this. You can counter it in various ways. Again, check my pattern. So that's it for the second problem. And there's a very similar conflict that comes right after this one, the one we've just seen. And that's the conflict between free will and omnipotence, or omnibenevolence and omnipotence. And it works similarly. It works something like this. So, again, religious people often believe that we have free will, we have choice, we have accountability. But hang on a minute. If God lets us have free will, then surely that limits his power, because it means God isn't in control of what we do. God isn't sovereign, right? He's not in charge, because God sort of limits his own power and lets us do what we want, right? So that seems to go against the idea of omnipotence. But there's a problem, though, because again, right, if you say that God doesn't let us have free will, so he's fully omnipotent, he controls every little action that we do, then again that goes against the idea of omnibenevolence, because then we have a picture where God punishes us for actions that are beyond our control. So it seems like in this case we have to choose between omnipotence and omnibenevolence, right? But we don't want that, we want both, okay? So let's have a look at answers to this problem. Now this is a very kind of Islamic problem. That doesn't mean that only Muslims face it, only the Muslim conception of God. But it does mean that it was addressed quite significantly in early Muslim circles. So, by the way, this is really good synoptic links. This is synoptic links with Islam, right, which gives you extra marks in terms of the mark scheme. If you write about this stuff, right, it makes you look better than your average religious studies student in the UK, because your average religious studies student in the UK does not study this, right? So it gives you an edge over everyone else. You know, sometimes students tell me, oh, why do we do Islam? Well, actually, it gives you a strength over other students, because it gives you unique material to work with. It makes you look original. So see it as a strength. Anyway, so as you remember from last year, the Mutazilite school, they were rationalists, weren't they? So they argued, yes, we do have free will, we do. But God is still all-powerful. It's just that God doesn't fully use his power. He sort of steps back a bit. That doesn't make him less powerful, right? It just means he doesn't make full use of his power, but he's still all-powerful. He just doesn't use all of it because he wants us to be free. He wants us to be able to make our own choices. Think of a parent who sort of steps back and lets their child just sort of discover the world in their own way, right? We don't like parents that are always all over their kids, you know, making sure that they're okay and so forth, right? A good parent is a parent that steps back a little bit and lets their child make their own mistakes and discover the world for themselves. And maybe God is a bit like this. God could just step in, and control our actions, but he doesn't do it. Now, if you want to answer this, again, you could say, well, is this real omnipotence, right? Because it looks like God isn't really in control. Even if God is in some sense all-powerful, he's not sovereign. He's not in charge of history. It makes him look a little bit powerless. You could argue, right? This is not a necessary thing to argue. But if you want to criticize it, you could say this. You could say, well, if he's like this, is he really worthy of worship? That's the first kind of Islamic solution to the problem of omnipotence and omnibenevolence. Here's another one. The Ash'arites, whom you've also heard of from last year. So the Ash'arites had a very interesting view. They believed that God was definitely all-powerful. And not only that, God does choose our actions for us. He creates every one of our actions, right? So it seems like we create our actions, but actually God does it. He's fully in control. However, the Ash'arites said that we still have free will, because God, on top of creating our actions, God also gives us a will or a desire to perform our actions. So for example, if God wants me to pick up this pen right here, he's going to create the action of picking up the pen. But he's also going to give me a desire to pick up the pen. So in the end, I'm doing what I desire. I'm doing what I want. And Ash'arites are going to say, well, that's just what it means to be free, to do what you want. Right? So we are free, even if God is fully in control of our actions, because we do what we want to do. Now, the major problem of this is it really free will? So this kind of theory of free will has often been called compatibilist, because it makes, or at least it tries to make free will compatible with determinism. But is it really free will? Surely if God controls every one of our actions, then we're not really free, because we're not choosing our actions, even if we just happen to desire to perform those actions. I mean, imagine a scenario where an evil scientist sort of plugs a machine into your brain and acts in such a way, programs the machine in such a way that it makes you do things, but it also makes you want to do those things, right? Now, this is a scenario in which you're doing what you want, but surely you aren't free because you're not choosing your own actions. And that's it for the omnipotence and free will and the Islamic sort of discussions about this. I'm going to finish with the fourth conflict, and that's the Euthyphro dilemma. It's quite an old conflict. It goes back to Plato. It's in one of his dialogues called the Euthyphro, because it's a dialogue in which Socrates, who's always in Plato's dialogues, has this discussion with a guy called Euthyphro. And it's a dilemma. So you have two choices, right? Either we say that God's commands are good because he commands them, or we say that God commands certain things because they are good. Now, if you look at each option, neither of them are particularly pleasant. And when we talk about dilemmas in philosophy, we talk about the different horns of a dilemma. So imagine a bull right here, and you have to grasp one of the horns. But in either case, you're going to get trashed by the bull, right? So it's a dilemma because the horn on the left is bad, but the horn on the right is just as bad. And in the case of the Euthyphro dilemma, that's the idea that's being put forward by Plato, right? No matter what you do, you have a problem. So in the first option, let's say that God could command, let's say that God's commands are good because he commands them. Well, the consequence of this is that God could just command all sorts of horrible things like torturing people for fun, right? And that would be good, right? Because whatever is good is just what God commands. God has absolute freedom over what he can command. But surely that goes against God's omnibenevolence if he can command horrible things like torturing people for fun, or rape, say, right? So that's why this horn, the first horn, is problematic. Let's look at the second option. Let's say that God commands certain things because they are good, so it's the opposite of the first one. But then the situation here is that it looks like God has to follow a higher standard of morality, right? So God has to command certain things because there's this great standard of morality, and God has to follow it. But that seems to go against his omnipotence. He's not supreme, he's not majestic if he has to follow a higher law over which he has no control. So again, it looks like we're in a situation where we have to pick omnibenevolence or omnipotence, and we can't have both. And that's a problem because we want both. So you have two options. You can either grasp the first horn or the second horn. Let's start with the first horn. So here's one solution, one possible solution. You can say, well, God's commands are good because he commands them. Right? So you're picking the first option. Now remember, the problem with that option is that then it looks like God can just command anything. Right? Even horrible things, like torturing people for fun. But here's what you could say. You could say, yeah, well, in principle he could, but he never would. He never would because it would go against his character. Right? God doesn't like torture. He doesn't like horrendous acts, so he never would, even if technically he has the power to. But it's just not the kind of thing that God would do. Now I happen to think that's probably the best solution to the Euthyphro dilemma. The only problem that I can think of is that it seems to go against the idea of omnipotence, right? Because it seems like God is limited by his character. I don't think that's a particularly serious problem, but if you wanted to argue against this, this is what you could say. Now, let's look at the other option. God commands certain things because they are good. Remember, the problem with that was that it seems to undermine God's omnipotence. Right? God sort of has to choose. There's a higher standard of morality, a higher standard of goodness, and God has to choose based on that higher standard. But this is what you could argue. You could say, well, it doesn't really limit God's omnipotence. It just looks like it, right? Because we can define omnipotence differently. To be omnipotent is to do whatever is logically possible to do. And that's Aquinas' definition, by the way. It's not just Aquinas' definition. I mean, it's probably the most standard definition of omnipotence. But he certainly advocated it. So maybe it's logically impossible for God to go against a higher moral standard. Maybe that's just, it's not that he's not powerful. It's just that this is a logical impossibility. It's like a square circle. So we don't think that God is less powerful because he can't make square circles. And here again, the sort of rebuttal that you could use here is to say, well, is this real omnipotence, right? So you can bring in Descartes here. And Descartes says that God is omnipotent in a very radical sense. God can break the laws of logic. He's not bound by them. He can even make square circles, right? And he can make a stone that he can't lift, things like that. So some people with very radical views of God's omnipotence are going to argue against this. Okay? And that's it for the Euthyphro dilemma. So, to summarize, we've got 4 conflicts. 4. 1, we've got the logical problem of evil, which you all know very well. And that's a conflict that involves all 3 of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. Okay? The second conflict has to do with free will and omniscience. And this conflict involves omniscience, obviously, but also omnibenevolence. Because if God doesn't give us free will, but then punishes us for actions that we can't help, then that goes against his goodness. 3, freedom and omnipotence, a very similar problem, but it's not exactly the same. So obviously this problem involves omnipotence, but again it also involves omnibenevolence, because if God doesn't give us free will, I've heard this a million times, if God doesn't give us free will but punishes us for actions over which we have no control, he is not just, and therefore not omnibenevolent. And finally, the Euthyphro dilemma, which asks, well, are God's commands bound by a higher standard of morality? Or can he just command anything? Right? And that creates a conflict between omnipotence and omnibenevolence, because a God who could command anything is a God who is not omnibenevolent, because he could command horrible actions. But then a God who can only command some things is a God who is not fully omnipotent. Or at least that's the argument. So 4 conflicts, and of course this conflict involves omnibenevolence and omnipotence, just like number 3. So 4 conflicts, again, for an essay, pick 2 or 3, at least 2. Don't go up to 4, I would say, because they each need to be treated with sufficient detail. So pick 3 of those, explain them, detail them, and then in your AO2 section, in each paragraph, explain whether you think they are real conflicts or whether they can be resolved. And that's conflicts between God's attributes.